The beginning of a notorious American crime case. Every generation seems to bring forth its own legends, some born of glory, some of horror. This particular story, now burned into the psyche of rural America, emerged from the shadowy primeval pine forests of the Pacific Northwest, where civilization and wilderness are always at a silent, shifting standoff. In the late 1970s, locals started whispering about strange vanishings, audacious heists, and the nerve of a faceless outlaw who struck fear into the heart of frontier communities spanning from Oregon to Montana. The authorities at first dismissed the rumors as the stuff of campfire tales or the exaggerations of backwoods folks, unaccustomed to the modern push into untamed landscapes. But as incident after incident tumbled in from logging towns, isolated ranger outposts, and wilderness cabins, a chilling realization set in. These events were not only real, but escalating. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, local sheriff's offices, and the newly formed environmental task forces found themselves staring at an unlikely adversary, one so adept at blending into the endless forests that some started calling him the Phantom of the Pines. He was said to move as easily through the woods as the wolves and the bears, knowing every game trail, every river bend, and every abandoned mining road. This outlaw wasn't robbing city banks or holding up trains like the old-time desperados. Instead, his notorious streak was carved from illicit timber poaching, rare animal smuggling, and a string of violent confrontations that left several rangers and would-be captors either dead or vanished without a trace. National media, ever hungry for the next big American true crime saga, pounced on the unfolding drama. Headlines screamed about the cost of the manhunt, the mystery of the culprit's identity, and the unprecedented challenge faced by law enforcement trying to chase a ghost who outsmarted helicopters, bloodhounds, and the best trackers in the country. The Phantom became a folk legend almost overnight. Some painted him as an eco-bandit fighting back against corporate environmental destruction. Others saw him as nothing more than a cold-blooded criminal exploiting the wild's deepest corners. Amid the mounting panic, a sense of awe grew too. Campers lowered their fires early in fear, loggers swapped stories of narrow escapes, and children went to sleep with one eye open. In Washington, D.C., top brass convened war room meetings, shuffling millions in resources to bring the Phantom to justice. Over the next decades, what began as a regional scare would explode into the longest, most expensive criminal pursuit in American environmental history. A hunt that would sear tragedy and controversy into the wild heart of the United States. A challenging beginning. The harrowing beginnings of Joe Callahan trace back to the rugged foothills on the Oregon-Idaho border during the early 1960s. Born into an isolated cabin where winters bit to the bone and summers were little more than burned-out brush, Joe's earliest memories were of deprivation, struggle, and a persistent fight for survival. His father was a drifter, sometimes logger, sometimes poacher, always one paycheck away from disappearing for weeks at a time. His mother, once spirited and hopeful, seemed eroded by each passing season, worn down by the relentless hardship that life in the Pacific Northwest demanded. From an early age, Joe learned that warmth and food were unpredictable luxuries. Without electricity or running water, the Callahan children had to chop their own wood, fetch water from a half-frozen creek, and sleep huddled together for warmth on straw mattresses. Joe was the eldest, so the responsibility of looking after his two siblings fell squarely on his shoulders. By the age of 8, he knew how to operate traps, snare rabbits, clean wild game, and patch leaking roofs, using whatever remnants and bent nails were left over in his father's toolbox. When distant, echoing gunshots rang through the woods, Joe listened for the measured pace that meant his father had returned safely, or the panicked pattern that suggested rival poachers had trespassed their territory. The forest, both enemy and friend, was his true classroom, where he deciphered animal tracks, followed game trails, and learned to move silently across packs of pine needles, senses stretched taut by hunger and caution. Joe was often sent alone into these shadowed woods, armed only with a battered .22 rifle and a hunting knife, told not to return until he'd found food. Isolation shaped much of Joe's worldview. The Callahan cabin was 2 hours from the nearest paved road, and school meant a perilous trek in winter, often undertaken on foot when the battered pickup refused to start. Joe's education was patchy at best, interrupted by days spent helping his father poach deer or log cedar illegally, with lessons in reading and mathematics delivered in the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. Doubt and suspicion of outsiders became second nature. Authorities, rangers, and even other struggling families were regarded as either threats or targets for trade. Amidst this relentless adversity, Joe's resilience and ingenuity flourished. His hands grew calloused and his mind sharp, quick to notice changes in the weather or hidden dangers in a stranger's glance. While other children played with marbles and slingshots, Joe's games were trap-laying contests and marksmanship drills, his laughter a rare sound that belonged only to the briefest moments of success, when he snared a deer or found a lost hatchet in the snow. As Joe reached adolescence, he developed a fierce protectiveness over his family and territory. He was a product of the forest's unforgiving code: provide, adapt, and defend at all costs. The poverty and social neglect that forged him also sowed the seeds for a brand of cunning, self-reliance, and latent hostility toward any figure of formal law or distant government. In those haunted woods, Joe Callahan took the first steps down a path from mere survivor to something far more formidable, and ultimately, infamous. The descent into crime. As the years passed, the hardships of Joe Callahan's early life didn't fade. They calcified into the very structure of his adulthood. By his late teens, Joe was already marked by an uncanny ability to survive, to hunt, and to disappear into the forest that had raised him. Barely 17, restless and embittered by the poverty that gnawed at his family, Joe saw little reason to trust the systems and laws set by people who'd never felt desperate hunger, or a Montana winter biting through threadbare coats. His entry into the criminal world didn't come all at once, but as a series of calculated choices, slippery and logical in the context of his experience. At first it was small time: illegal trapping, trading pelts under the counter at backwoods bars, slipping quietly through state lines with a trunk full of poached furs. The thrill of evasion, the crisp bills passed by men in pickup trucks, the adrenaline rush of outsmarting a warden, all this proved intoxicating. With each risk that ended in success, the next one grew bigger, and the justifications louder in his own head. "If the land owes me anything, it's a living," he'd mutter, echoing the resentment passed down around dinner tables and cabins, where the government's rules meant mouths went hungry. When Joe met other young men, similarly cast out or disillusioned, they formed an unspoken brotherhood: the Woodsman Outlaws. Together, they branched out from trapping to unregulated lumbering, felling ancient Douglas firs under the cover of night, hauling logs through secret river routes, distributing the lumber to fly-by-night mills far from prying eyes. Their operation tapped deeper veins of the black market, connecting with shadowy middlemen and even whispers of organized crime figures down in Seattle. But it wasn't only survival or greed that kept Joe going, it was the defiant thrill, the way crime gave meaning and structure to his life. He began to develop a reputation, part myth, part menace, as stories of the Phantom of the Pines spread across the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Sometimes he shared spoils with struggling families, solidifying his Robin Hood legend. Other times he didn't care who lost, so long as he won. His ability to elude authorities grew sharper, his work more brutal, and in the wake of his shadow, a sense of unease began to settle over the towns that bordered the infinite woods. Scales of Justice, U.S. Forest Service. Amidst the swelling chaos in the Pacific Northwest, a new figure of hope quietly emerged in the heart of the American justice system: the United States Forest Rangers. With their ranks spread thin across millions of acres of untamed land, these men and women, equal parts conservationists, peacekeepers, and survivalists, were charged with the Herculean task of defending the nation's wild heritage against a rising tide of lawlessness. The oncoming storm wasn't just about poachers and thieves, it was about safeguarding an ideal, a living frontier that had always seemed to hover between legend and reality. At the forefront of this silent war stood Jake Morrison, a young ranger with the grit of generations carved into his bones. Having grown up trekking the rugged backcountry of Colorado, Jake brought a distinctive mix of unyielding moral code, practical know-how, and a stubborn empathy for both the land and its people. To those who called the forests home, loggers, homesteaders, native tribes, he was both advocate and enforcer. To his colleagues, he was the rare officer who understood that justice in the wilderness required more than just a badge and a gun. It took patience, deep listening, and an encyclopedic knowledge of every clearing, stream, and silent path. Under Jake's guidance, the Forest Rangers joined forces with local sheriffs, federal agents, and even environmental scientists. They built complex intelligence networks, blending fieldcraft with cutting-edge surveillance, drones overhead, scents carried by trained dogs, secret cameras hidden in tree knots. But for all the technology and tenacity, the real battleground was always the untamed woods, where the outlaws' mastery of camouflage and terrain repeatedly tested the rangers' resolve. Day after day, Jake and his team braved bitter weather, booby-trapped trails, and the ever-present specter of violence. They rescued hikers lost in the mist, dismantled illegal logging camps, and sat through tense nocturnal vigils inside battered field cabins. Small victories, recovering a rare bear cub, saving a veteran logger from an ambush, rippled through the anxious communities, stoking fragile hope. Yet defeat would often follow closely, a fellow ranger caught in a snare, forest fires set as distraction, or the sickening discovery that a trusted informant had vanished without a trace. Still, every setback only thickened Jake's determination. He spent long nights drawing maps, compiling dossiers, urging his weary team never to give up. For him, protecting the forest was more than a job or duty. It was a sacred trust, a promise to every child who learned to fish in crystal brooks, and to every eagle that soared the ancient skies. As the chase for the notorious outlaw escalated, the Rangers' resolve, and Jake Morrison's legend, would be forged in the smoky twilight between law and wilderness, where every day demanded both courage and humility, expanding the Shadow Empire. As the authorities grew more vigilant, pouring effort and resources into policing the forests and mountainous stretches of the Pacific Northwest, the Phantom refused to be cornered. Relentless and cunning, he transformed what began as survival tactics and small-scale poaching into a sprawling, intricate underworld, not just of his own making, but as a toxic ecosystem that lured and trapped many. With every crackdown, the Phantom adapted. He learned the ebb and flow of patrol routes better than most rangers did. Under the towering pines and thick mists, he mapped out escape trails so elaborate that even seasoned trackers doubted themselves. The forests for the Phantom were not simply a hideout, they were a living, breathing fortress, each hollow log or burbling stream marked in his memory as part of a vast, invisible network. Increasingly, he recruited not only outlaws and thrill-seekers but also desperate locals. Men and women ground down by unemployment, rising costs, and the slow collapse of traditional logging communities. To them, the Phantom offered money, protection, and a chance to belong. His network grew from a handful of loyalists to an army of woodsmen, hunters, trappers, and opportunists who shared information, ferried stolen goods, and sometimes provided alibis or false leads to the authorities. The borders between criminal and honest work grew dangerously blurry. A logger might spend one day hauling legal timber, and the next, smuggling illegal bear gallbladders or rare furs at dusk. As profits increased, so did ambition and danger. The operation was no longer about game or wood, but rare medicinal plants, black market animal parts, and even illegal arms. Makeshift outposts, hidden cabins with coded markings, began to dot the backcountry, run by trusted lieutenants who managed smuggling routes and settled disputes with quiet efficiency. The Triangle, a stretch of Oregon, Washington, and Montana, became notorious for missing persons, booby-trapped animal trails, and whispered rumors of a hidden council moving stolen gold or laundering money. What started as individual acts of lawlessness evolved into an organized syndicate with layers of secrecy, extensive bribery, and brutal retribution for betrayal. Those drawn in were bound by fear as much as loyalty. Nobody wanted to be on the wrong side of the Phantom's justice. For the broader region, the forests themselves seemed to change, thicker with suspicion and invisible boundaries, as much territory for crime as they were for wildlife. The pinnacle of crime and escalation. The peak of the Phantom's criminal reign swept across the Pacific Northwest like a violent, creeping storm. By the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, what once began as sporadic, almost desperate skirmishes evolved into a barrage of orchestrated crime that made the Phantom's name synonymous with terror, audacity, and an uncanny sense of control over the woods he called home. He wasn't merely stealing resources, he was challenging the very notion of law and order. Sawmills went up in flames under night's thick cover, rangers found their cabins ransacked and booby-trapped, and even federal officers treaded lightly, knowing any raid into the dark pines might end in gunfire or never return at all. Tension crackled through every small town bordering the wild. No longer were the Phantom's crew a handful of desperate men. By this time his network had morphed into a near-military operation. Highwaymen patrolled worn backroads, lookouts perched in ancient spruce canopies, relaying coded warnings by radio and elaborate signs cut into tree bark. With notoriety came bolder crimes. Several rangers and officers, each determined to stamp out the spreading chaos, vanished without a trace, signed off as missing, presumed dead. Petty theft was replaced by large-scale illegal timber shipments sneaking down rushing rivers at midnight, and caches of rare animal trophies were discovered concealed in remote caves. Emboldened by his success and legendary elusiveness, the Phantom even staged brazen assaults on official convoys, seizing evidence and weapons that would later be tracked to further attacks. What unnerved authorities most was his ability to inspire both fear and perverse admiration. Some locals, angered by restrictive logging laws or sympathetic to his anti-government rhetoric, began aiding his operations, feeding him information and shelter. The rift between law enforcers and rural communities widened, sowing mutual suspicion and making every investigation labyrinthine. And all the while, the violence climbed. Armed standoffs in the mist-laden woods became sickeningly common. On more than one occasion, entire search parties dispatched into the Phantom's domain failed to return, their radios going dead after cryptic SOS signals. Each time law enforcement tried to tighten their grip, the Phantom responded with escalating force, ambushes, sabotage, and chilling threats carved into cabin doors or painted on highway overpasses. Journalists dubbed these years the era of blood and bark, when law and lawlessness warred out in the ancient forest with no end in sight. The criminal network and the police's impasse. Throughout the peak of Joe Callahan's criminal ascent, his greatest weapon was never just his own skill in the wild. It was the tangled web of accomplices and the near-invisible network he carefully cultivated across the Pacific Northwest. Local outcasts, disgruntled loggers, black market traders, and even the occasional corrupt official found their way into Joe's orbit. Some were lured by money, others by a shared grudge against what they saw as overreaching federal control. Many joined out of sheer fear, knowing that refusal often came with consequences. Joe never relied solely on brute force. Instead, he invested deeply in forging personal connections. He offered favors, protection, and sometimes even a perverse sense of camaraderie. He memorized the quirks of every operator in his network, rewarded loyalty with generosity, and punished betrayal with ruthless efficiency. Over time, this loyalty bred silence and made infiltrating the group nearly impossible for law enforcement. To the frustrated rangers and agents, it sometimes seemed as though every attempt to close in on Joe was anticipated and countered. A simple message, a coded knock at an isolated cabin door, a phrase said at a logging bar, would ripple through the chain. By the time the police or the Forest Service launched a raid, Joe and his people would have melted away into the trees. Evidence vanished. Nobody talked. Everyone helped cover tracks in exchange for a cut or simply peace of mind in a dangerous territory. Rumors abounded in the regional policing community that Joe's underground was broader than anyone dared estimate. It wasn't just a matter of hiding from the law. The network provided fake paperwork, safe houses built beneath fallen timber, and, shockingly, tip-offs from those who were supposed to stop him. Even communications towers in remote valleys occasionally blinked off just before a raid, thanks to a sympathetic technician in Joe's pay. Each failed operation strained the authorities further. Funds dwindled, morale dipped, and over time, the daunting forests seemed to swallow not just outlaws, but also any hope of legal justice. In meetings behind closed doors, officers admitted what no one wanted to put on record. As long as Joe Callahan's web of loyalty and intimidation reached into every isolated town, the law was powerless to untangle this wild American maze. Special Case and the Trap of Despair. The pressure had reached fever pitch, both among law enforcement agencies and the fearful public, by the time federal authorities established the special task force devoted solely to bringing the Phantom to justice. Headed by the steely Jake Morrison, whose reputation for tenacity had earned him both the admiration and irritation of his peers, the task force brought together the most experienced rangers, sharpshooters, trackers, and forensic experts from across the United States. Every detail was meticulously planned. Satellite imagery was juxtaposed with decades-old logging maps, and heat-sensitive cameras scanned the dense firs and pines from the air. They set up mobile command stations camouflaged among the trees. Helicopters hovered overhead while dogs trained to track even the faintest human scent swept the undergrowth. For the first time, law enforcement began working closely with former poachers and reformed criminals, hoping their knowledge of the wild could give them an edge. But the Phantom seemed always one step ahead. Whenever the task force closed in on a shack, burrow, or hidden passage scouted from intelligence, they'd find only the ghosts of campfires or footprints deliberately scattered to obscure their direction. The most advanced technology appeared clumsy when set against the raw cunning of a man who'd been raised by the wilds themselves. As weeks stretched into months, the optimism of the initial campaign withered, replaced by exhaustion and second-guessing. Morale among task force members was stretched thin. They endured icy downpours, relentless mosquitoes, treacherous terrain, and the gnawing paranoia that came with chasing a specter no one could truly see. Occasionally, traps meant for the Phantom would be found sabotaged, as if he mocked their efforts. There were incidents where operatives came terrifyingly close to capture. A sniper's scope catching only the fleeting rustle of a branch, a tracker's dog led into a false scent trail ending in a near-fatal pit trap. Just as they were convinced of imminent success, the Phantom would vanish, sometimes right under their noses. The task force poured millions into undercover informants, wiretaps in rural bars, and bribes for anyone who could offer a credible lead. Yet the deeper their investigation went, the more they realized the Phantom's network wasn't just about fear, it was built on intricate webs of loyalty and survival. Entire families in remote settlements might depend on his largesse or fear his vengeance. In one instance, the team laid a months-long trap involving staged busts, double agents, and intercepted radio communications. They waited with growing anticipation in a glade, believing they had finally triangulated his location to a square mile. But after weeks of surveillance, all they uncovered was a single, mocking talisman nailed to a tree, a sign that read, "Better luck next time." By the late 1990s, frustration mounted, politicians demanded results as public money and hope dwindled. Morrison's personal resolve was tested as the lines blurred between hunter and hunted. Rumors began to swirl, even among law enforcement, that catching the Phantom might simply be impossible, that some wild spaces could never truly be tamed by human law, no matter how many resources or how advanced the technology. And yet, battered but unwavering, the task force continued its desperate pursuit, refusing to believe that the legend of the Phantom would be the final word in their struggle. The classic escape. The iconic prison break stands as one of the most audacious episodes in American criminal lore, echoing through the corridors of law enforcement as a cautionary tale of ingenuity and desperation. The Phantom, now a household enigma, was held in the Montana State Penitentiary, a fortress of concrete and steel, renowned for its cutting-edge surveillance systems and nearly unbreakable security protocols. Everyone assumed the reign of infamy had finally reached its end, but the Phantom, true to his name, was merely getting started. Every detail of his daily routine was monitored, camera eyes watching every move, guards following rigid schedules, and even his correspondence censored for coded messages. Yet hubris proved to be the system's fatal flaw. Routines create patterns, and patterns, the Phantom understood, could be manipulated. In the months leading up to the escape, he disguised exceptional patience as resignation, masking meticulous observation under the veneer of boredom. He befriended a handful of trusted inmates, trading information and illicit favors. Through the prison grapevine, he learned about the weaknesses, maintenance rounds delayed by budget cuts, a faulty lock overlooked in an unused maintenance corridor, and the precise moment when the night shift was distracted by the changing of the guard. It all came to a head one stormy evening with thunder rattling the cell blocks and rain obscuring the external sensors. The Phantom and two accomplices enacted a flawless choreography, distracting a guard with a staged medical emergency, slipping out through a utility shaft beneath a malfunctioning camera, and ascending into the blinding darkness beyond the prison walls. By the time the alarm sounded, they were already deep in the Montana backwoods, moving with the practiced ease of predators returning to their native wild. The aftermath was a sensation. News tickers blared the story across the nation. A mythical fugitive had humiliated the system, leaving behind a trail of chaos and speculation. The prison warden was suspended, officials scrambled for answers, and a multi-state manhunt began. The media dubbed it the stain on American justice, while conspiracy theories abounded. Some whispered that corrupt guards had assisted, others claimed the Phantom was simply a genius born out of society's neglect. For the American public, the escape embodied both terror and fascination. For law enforcement, it was an undeniable wake-up call. Security protocols were rewritten, prison budgets overhauled, and the Phantom's legend, now elevated to something almost supernatural, grew ever more untouchable. With every passing day, his tracks faded a little further into the thick wilderness, and the chase began anew, fiercer and more desperate than ever before. The final violent years. The final savage years. After the infamous prison break, the Phantom's descent into violence escalated to levels that haunted both authorities and local communities. No longer content with the shadows, he brazenly challenged law enforcement head-on, orchestrating attacks that rattled even the toughest officers. Police departments across the Pacific Northwest went on high alert, training their searchlights and nerves for the next unpredictable strike. It appeared the Phantom relished the constant state of siege he imposed, his actions daring, cruel, and strangely theatrical. In these years, the Phantom's tactics shifted from stealth to all-out assault. Armed groups loyal to him set up ambushes on forest roads, targeting logging convoys, ranger outposts, and even state police caravans. There were reports of entire logging camps set ablaze in the dead of night, warning messages carved into trees, and anonymous packages sent to local officials with chilling threats inside. The line between rumor and fact blurred. His name became synonymous with destruction. By now, the Phantom's network operated like a wartime syndicate. Informers embedded within towns and wilderness communities relayed information, tipping him off about planned raids and roadblocks. In one bold move, his crew held a remote ranger station hostage for days, demanding supplies, transportation, and radio silence in exchange for the rangers' safety. Negotiations stretched, and the threat of violence loomed over every interaction. Local families caught in the crossfire lived in constant dread. Children would flinch at shadows, ranchers clung to their rifles, and store owners formed impromptu watch groups at night. The increased federal presence brought more helicopters overhead and unmarked vehicles along dusty main roads, but morale waned as months dragged into years. The sense that the Phantom was untouchable, almost a ghost, pervaded even the most hardened agents. Despite relentless manhunts, tip lines, and high-tech surveillance, every attempt to capture the Phantom ended with him slipping through the net. Sometimes there were clues, a fresh boot print, a fleeting radio signal, but always too little, too late. Some said he was fueled by vengeance, others argued it was nihilistic thrill. Either way, the violence became more coordinated and the risks greater with every passing season. As time wore on, this final chapter of lawlessness left an indelible mark. Forests bore scars, charred remains of once thriving camps, shelled-out patrol vehicles hidden by ferns, quiet memorials for rangers lost in the line of duty. Communities learned to mourn in silence, and many hoped, almost superstitiously, that the end of the Phantom's reign was near. The wages of fear were paid in sleepless nights in a region forever changed by a predator who made the wilderness his final, ruthless stage. The bloody denouement, the final rampage. Hunted relentlessly, and his circle shrinking, Lucas's actions take a savage turn. With resources dwindling, paranoia drives him to strike back at perceived traitors with shocking brutality. Desperate not to fade quietly, he launches a spree of violence across several cities. Bank holdups devolve into pitched gun battles, and police roadblocks are met with ambushes. Lucas takes revenge on those he suspects have betrayed him. Old allies vanish overnight, and coded messages on the dark web hint at his next moves. Media hysteria peaks as body counts rise. Local law enforcement is outgunned, neighborhoods go into lockdown, and the FBI faces public and political outrage. Emily Carter, haunted by the carnage and her own unraveling team, pushes herself beyond all limits. Each violent act by Lucas seems both a desperate plea to retain control and a final statement of defiance to a society he believes wronged him from birth. As the rampage climaxes, a brutal confrontation erupts in the ruins of an abandoned Detroit shopping mall. Lucas cornered, Carter's team battered and at their breaking point. The ensuing firefight leaves the city reeling, families mourning, and a nation reminded how easily order can be lost. In the aftermath, legends are born, not from victory, but from the scars left behind. Enduring aftershocks, America re-examined. In the aftermath of Lucas Rain's saga, the United States grapples with far more than broken glass and spent shell casings. The psychological scars sear deeper than physical ones. Communities must reconcile with nights spent under curfew, loved ones lost to unintended violence, and the lingering sense that even in the heart of America, order is more fragile than anyone dared believe. Think pieces, documentaries, and legal battles proliferate, each attempting to dissect the roots of Rain's rise and the system's repeated failures. For policymakers and law enforcement, the response is twofold: introspection on civil liberties and trust in government, alongside a surge in calls for harsher measures and increased surveillance. The balance between justice and freedom teeters uneasily on a knife's edge. At street level, however, the reckoning is quieter and more relentless. Businesses shuttered by fear reopen with new security systems, if they reopen at all. Teachers, counselors, and clergy spend years piecing together the fabric of communities torn by trauma. Children travel routes they hope are safer, their parents' warnings echoing in their minds. For Emily Carter, the victory is Pyrrhic, and the wounds are personal. She struggles to reconcile the law's imperfections with her own mistakes, haunted by both those she could not save and those she stopped too late. Lucas Rain's legend slowly morphs from a sensational headline into a somber parable, one that reminds Americans above all of the cost of neglecting the cracks in their own foundations. In the twilight after the hunt, the country is left to examine itself, not just its laws and protocols but the dreams and vulnerabilities of ordinary citizens. The aftershocks echo through daily life, in ways no news cycle could ever capture. The true ending, as for all great American tragedies, remains unresolved, in whispered caution, in new reform, and in the uneasy hope that next time the nation will spot the warning signs before they become a catastrophe.